I'm recording this also so that it'll be posted on my site, but the slides are already posted. They're at bit.ly/ne-HDR, NE like New England. Now, you've just had some cake, so you might want to get a little exercise. I recommend that those of you who have not seen this before go to the back of the room and then start walking forward. And you will see the angry person change from one side to the other. I'm going to hold my hands up so you can see I'm not controlling anything. I will not move a toe or anything. Does anyone want to walk? It's quite an interesting phenomenon. I've made a large version and a small version. At least one of them should change from one side to the other as you come forward. And the reason that I'm doing this is that the only difference between the two pictures, they're both composite pictures, is where the eye's contrast sensitivity function lies. And the contrast sensitivity function is changing as you're walking closer to the screen. You're moving from a lower spatial frequency to a higher spatial frequency. So when everyone's come back to the front, I'll show you your eye's contrast sensitivity function. So contrast is really important. And another word for contrast is dynamic range. Okay, so this is a contrast sensitivity grading. Spatial frequency is increasing to the right. Contrast is increasing to the top. Does everyone see a curve along the bottom? Okay, it isn't there. Your visual system is putting in the curve. And again, if you walked from the back of the room to the front, you would see the bottom of the curve move around. This is a curve in the opposite direction. This is a modulation transfer function curve. It's how much of the contrast is getting through at different spatial frequencies. Now, we refer to something called sharpness. Any word that ends in ness is a psychophysical function. Brightness, sharpness, it's something that's happening in you. It's not a physical phenomenon. So we can talk about resolution, that's a physical phenomenon. We can talk about contrast, that's a physical phenomenon. But sharpness is based on either the area under the curve or the square of the area under the curve. There are two schools of thought. Area under the curve is Ari and Zeiss. Square of the area is Sony and RCA. Whichever one you pick, obviously the area under the curve is fairly significant. And what the shape of the curve is determined by lots of things: optical filters, lens, sensor sampling, digital filters, and so on. So when Sony came out with HD Cam, they were not at the time able to record the full HD signal, and so they did a compromise. They went to 1440 in the Luma instead of 1920, which meant that they were dropping a quarter of the resolution. But the area under the curve that they dropped is much smaller. So if you compare even HD Cam and HD Cam SR, yes, absolutely, you can see the difference. But it's not a gigantic difference. It's a small difference. And that's how Sony was able to get away with doing HD Cam. Panasonic did something similar in DVC Pro and so on. Now, if we could somehow increase that part of the curve, then we're increasing the sharpness in the high resolution area tremendously. And if we could increase the whole curve, that yellow one is now what I've been showing up there, then we've got tremendous amount more area under the curve, and so we're increasing the sharpness. So increasing contrast increases sharpness. So now we get into dynamic range. A definition of dynamic range, it's the range from the darkest to the lightest perceptible parts of the picture, or basically contrast ratio. And we have different conditions and different types of TV sets. This is a quick survey I did of 2016 models. The dimmest one seems to be 138 nits or candelas per meter squared. And reflection off the screen seems to range from 0.4, which is the lowest that I saw, up to 2.6%. off the faceplate of the TV. Now, it's not the same as the contouring that you heard. So bit depth is not the same as contrast range. We could get this into any number of bits. Each additional bit would simply increase the signal-to-noise ratio. But that's only if we do it right, which means there has to be 1/2 LSB of noise. And if you do any processing, fade, do anything else, you need to maintain that noise in what comes out. For those of you who would like more information on this, there was a good article in the SMPTE journal in 1989 about dynamic rounding. If you go to the IEEE Explore thing and put in dynamic rounding, it'll explain that more. So here is a picture that's reasonably exposed for the outside there, the trees and so on. And now let's open up the camera a bit. Well, now we're clipping lots of the detail that was outside. We're getting some information here, but we really can't see what's going on. No, it's okay. You can leave the lights on. It's fine. And now let's open up the camera even more, and now we're probably reasonably exposed for the people inside the gondola. We're still not exposed well enough for whatever's going in there, and the outside is just totally burnt out. So that's why we talk about having higher dynamic range, so we can capture all of that together. Now, it's not a new concept. This was the ARRI D20, which came out in 2005 and was the precursor of all of the 35 millimeter sensor size motion image cameras. But back in 1982, Ikegami had a tube-based EC35, the EC for electronic cinematography, and it had a knee circuit for doing compression of dynamic range, so it would offer more dynamic range. Almost every camera manufacturer has had some form of compressing dynamic range. Sony has a terrific thing I like to use called Hyper Gamma, but everybody's got some version of it. Now, on the display end, it's also not a new thing. Some of you may recognize the RCA CT100. It was their first color TV, sold in 1954. One of the only TVs to use the NTSC phosphors. Now, this green triangle over here, that's the SMPTE phosphors, or basically Rec 709. So that's the color gamut. But this outer thing over here, the gigantic triangle, that's the NTSC phosphors. That's what this TV had. So we had wide color gamut in 1953. Why did we get rid of the wide color gamut? Because it was dim, and people prefer brighter images. So they went to a reduced color gamut so they could get brighter images. Here is an illustration of how people like brighter images even when they're not brighter. Remember, brightness is a psychophysical function. So all of these images have exactly the same luminance value. They're coming off the same monitor. But this is 3200K, this is 6500K, which is what you would think TVs would be. But this is what TVs that are sold is, which is 9300K, because just making it bluer makes it look brighter. And that's what people want at home. This was at NAB in 2010, so ARRI came out with the Alexa, and this company from Australia, Live Technologies, had something called the Live Lens, and they were using an LCD in the lens to dim areas and thereby take a low sensitivity or high sensitivity picture, low sensitivity picture, high sensitivity picture, and combine them to get high dynamic range. So you may have heard from many people saying that HDR gives you the most bang for the bit, and that's based on these test charts, and I've reproduced them with the same vertical axis, which is why this one is so small over here. So this was first shown by the EBU, and going from HD to 4K, unquestionably there's an improvement. Statistically significant improvement, absolutely, hands down. But it's not that great an improvement. If you sit really close to the set, it's about a half a grade of improvement. If you sit at normal viewing distances, about a third of a grade of improvement. If you go to higher frame rate, you get a much greater improvement. Going from 60 to 100 is a full grade, going from 60 to 120 rather, from 120 to 240, another full grade of improvement. But doing that, every time you double the frame rate, you're doubling the amount of data that you have to deal with. And then this chart is from the École Polytechnique Fédérale in Lausanne in Switzerland, but the EBU is almost identical, and I'll show you that in a moment. And they're showing that increasing what they called the dynamic range gives you the sharpest or the steepest slope of improvement, and anything from 0 to maybe 20% increase in bit rate depending on what you think you need to do. Here's how low the bit rate can be. This is the Philips HDR system, and this was their demo setup at IBC last fall. They want 35 bytes per scene, not per second, not per frame, per scene, to go from SDR to HDR. So that was grade number one, that it's the most bang for the bit. Here's grade number two. You get more colors with the same primaries. This is the familiar chromaticity diagram. This white thing that you don't often see in the middle is called Pointer's gamut of surface colors. That's the real world colors that are out there. But that's only at one luminance level. So here it is at 3 different luminance levels, and you can see the chromaticity changes, but also the gamut of surface colors changes. So if you can increase the luminance levels that you're offering to the viewer, you're increasing the gamut of colors without increasing the chromaticity points of the phosphors. This is a great number 3 that Grass Valley promotes. I'm not so sure I agree with this one, but this was at a particular thing that they did as a test, MotoGP Valencia, and this guy is doing the usual shading for the SDR version, and this guy is doing the shading for the HDR version, and he's not even looking at the monitor because he knows he's going to capture everything he needs. So this was at NAB last year, not this year. JVC booth, no new technologies are needed. They're showing HDR stuff that's there. This was at the HPA Tech Retreat that year. That's Jan Fröhlich, who's from the Media University in Stuttgart. You'll see a little bit more about that in a moment. And he's showing some HDR content like what you saw before. There's a Christie laser projector, very high output, HDR, almost the full BT 2020 color gamut. And here's some pictures I shot in Times Square. So this is an LED display, and it's certainly doing fine. And you can see it's in daylight. Over here, I'm showing some displays in full direct sunlight. So those are LED displays in full direct sunlight, and they are presenting pictures. And as far as projectors are concerned, companies like Scalable Display Technologies from this area have stuff to combine as many projectors as you want if you need to get more brightness that way. Here's NAB this year. Atomos put HDR displays into their little handheld recorders. Small HD went to HDR. This is TV Logic. This was interesting. It was a demonstration at Panasonic, and it's one of their demos with a 1,000-nit monitor, and they were in a dark room. As you can see, there's practically no surround there, so now I'm blowing that up so you can see a little more of the monitor, and now I'm just blowing up this side, and that's the monitor they were using. Now, normally, if they do that, they would take a little piece of black tape and put it over that. But they didn't do that this time because they're saying, hey, the whole industry is moving towards HDR. We don't care if we happen to be using a Sony monitor. That's fine. This is a lens that came out at NAB this year, and what's significant about that, it's a 107:1 zoom range, which is the greatest range that Fuji has. I would say it's the greatest zoom range ever, except that Panavision showed a compound lens one year that was 300:1 that nobody ever used as far as I know. But it came out in the 4K Ultra HD version immediately. Now, there's no such thing as a 4K lens. Any lens, a piece of Coca-Cola bottle will pass 4K. But Fuji designed the lens so that it would have higher contrast transmission at the higher spatial frequencies, and also they came up with a new coating so it's transmitting more light, and so you can get more contrast range out of it. This is an interesting picture in that the only light that exists in that room is coming from this lamp that is aimed directly into the camera. And yet, from where I'm standing, I can see every chip of the chip chart over here. So this was shown at the SMPTE Digital Cinema Summit, which is now the Future of Cinema Conference. And that was in 2008, shown by Peter Sentin of what was then Thomson Grass Valley. You can see the individual coils of the filament. You can see the safety mesh in the glass in front of the lamp, and still every chip. So that's a 10 million to 1 contrast ratio, or more than 23 f-stops. So grade number 5, there is already HDR to SDR available, and fully automatic. You don't have to do anything, and inexpensive. These were 3 of the companies that were showing it at NAB. I'm going to concentrate on this center one, ISO Video, little tiny company. Again, fully automatic conversion with local contrast preserved. And so here is Jan Fröhlich again from the Media University in Stuttgart, and there's a URL. You can go to his site and see how they did all their stuff. But basically, they used a mirror rig with 2 cameras, 2 Alexas, and one of them was stopped down from the other, and then they combined them to get a minimum of 18 stops of contrast ratio that they were showing this stuff on. So let's take a look at that picture back there again. And there's the picture shot with more than 18 stops of contrast ratio as processed by the ISO Video HDR to SDR converter. And you can make out the faces of all the people down here. You can make out the lights, the individual lights in this thing. Nothing is blooming, nothing is clipping. And you are looking at the worst possible conditions here. These lights are shining directly on the screen. You can see the light over there. There seems to be an incompatibility also between my computer and the projector. So if you can make out all this stuff under these conditions, it's pretty good. But, oh, well, you're showing a still frame. What about video? So here's some video. No clipping on any of those sparks that are flying. No clipping in the flame, so you can see the inner flame is brighter than the outer flames. And here's another one with a more of a story. I like that the little dust motes are floating in the air. Those of you sitting close enough can see those. And there's somebody in the shadows over here. He places his order. Person in the shadows thinks that she should have been served first. And in the shadows, we see him falling over backwards. So you can shoot HDR right now and convert to SDR, no problem. Going the other way, not so much. So this was at Harmonic's booth at NAB this year. There's an HDR display, there's an SDR display. You can see they're basically showing the same thing. This one is dimmer than that. Yes, absolutely. There's SDR to HDR up conversion. I'm not sure what that is. All of the tools are seemingly available, so even this new waveform monitor that Leader came up with, even if you're shooting HDR, there are going to be times when you're going to exceed the dynamic range of what you're shooting with, so they show you over here, and you can decide, oh, okay, it's fine if the headlight is burning out. I don't care about that, but maybe I do care about what's in this tent. And so, yay for joy. If I stop here, HDR is absolutely wonderful, and it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, and let's all do it immediately. And I'll even go a little bit farther. At the NAB show, there was a super session, and there was remarkable consensus among all the people on there, except on as to what to wear and how much facial hair to have. But there was a pundit, a broadcaster, a consultant, a manufacturer, SMPTE's president is in there, a reporter's in there. Everyone agrees HDR gives the most bang for the buck, for the bid. So that's the great. But now the okay. There was also a remarkable consensus that HDR is not ready to be transmitted to the home. So why? I've shown you things from 2008. I've shown you things from as far back as 1982. Here's in 2006 at the NAB. This is one of the slides I did for an NAB wrap-up that year. Sony, just one manufacturer, was selling HD displays in 4 different aspect ratios that year. And so at NAB, they said, well, no problem. We're just going to use AFD and bar data and pan and scan, and you'll be well equipped for the multi-aspect ratio universe. And so here we are in 2016, and this cartoon ran in the New Yorker last September. And the reason it was funny is that everybody who reads the New Yorker has seen somebody who's got fat people on their TV. So, okay, things take time. HD TV takes time. Okay, number 2, we need all new equipment. We don't need any new technology, but you got to buy new cameras, you got to buy new displays, and so on. Grass Valley is kind of interesting. That picture I showed you with the more than 23 stop dynamic range, that was a sensor that Grass Valley was using in 2008. They have yet to sell a camera that will do that. The sensor is in the camera, and they've come up with a license to get, I think it's 15 stops now, and then maybe they'll come up with another license to give you 20 stops, and then maybe someday they'll come up with a license to give you 23 stops. This is an interesting camera that I'll talk about in a moment, the LDK86N. But here's a Vizio display. Peter was talking about Vizio before, and he had his litany of very cheap products at CES. Well, this one is still $6,000 list price. But it'll come down. Now, here's the interesting thing about that camera. Grass Valley has come up with something they had a long time ago called dynamic pixel management. And it allows you to combine pixels. So if you pay for the license, this is a 4K camera and it's got 4K chips in it. If you don't pay for the license, or for whatever reason you choose to stay HD, then the pixels combine and they end up with larger areas. And as you were hearing from Mike Bergeron previously, larger areas can collect more photons. Now, you can also do things like do this virtually on this and get both 4K and higher dynamic range. Whether any camera manufacturer is doing that yet, I'm not sure. Again, this is a 2/3 inch format photo site for HD. It's 5 microns by 5 microns. And for 4K, it's 2.5 microns by 2.5 microns. Doesn't mean you can't get great HDR out of 4K 2/3 inch camera. Sony's 4300 does a beautiful job. So this was at IBC in 2013. They had a debate on whether 4K was necessary, and the Hollywood Reporter ran a story, and they quoted somebody in the debate as saying, a 4K display delivers the best HD you've ever seen. So I dragged that guy over to the ARRI booth where he could look at HDR and 4K displays, and he said, yeah, you're right, the HDR looks better. Because HDR can increase picture detail by reducing clipping, and by giving you more contrast, gives you more sharpness. I think most of you can see that this looks sharper than that. There's about a 3% difference in contrast ratio between those two gradings. Next, okay, which HDR? Well, you heard earlier about IP having different standards, but we can do some conversion. There are multiple types of HDR delivery to the home. The SMPTE standard is the PQ, which was Dolby's. The Arab standard is HLG, which is BBC and NHK. Philips and Technicolor have their things. One of the papers that was presented at NAB this year was from BBC saying, you know, you can convert between the two. So this is going to get worked out. It's okay. Things take time. It's just not something that we can do immediately. Ken Kirschbaumer, who'd been to 26 consecutive NAB shows, said pretty clear after this NAB that we need a Moses and fast. You heard about the Ultra HD Premium and the two different versions that they have. As Pete was saying, for the LCDs, they have 1,000 nits brightness and less than 0.05 in black. And then for the OLEDs, 540 in brightness and 0.0005 in black. And I'll talk about that in a little while. But let's just talk about these 1,000 and 540 for a moment. This is the chart that I showed you before. It's blown up now because I don't have to compare the vertical scale to anybody else. And this is comparing the EBU to the EPFL, and there's very high correlation there. So everybody's getting pretty much the same results. But what are they measuring? Look at the horizontal scale there. It's not contrast. It's peak brightness. And we know that people like to have brighter pictures on their TVs. How do we get the HDR to the TV? Again, potentially an issue. And then there are interactions. If you read only one paper in the SMPTE journal this year, you should read Sean McCarthy's paper, which is going to be in the current issue. It hasn't come out yet. How independent are HDR, WCG, and HFR in human visual perception and the creative process? Some amazing, mind-blowing stuff there. HDR interacts with frame rate, viewing angle, brightness, hue in different directions, programming, and viewing time. And I'll talk about some of those. So here's frame rate. This is not from Sean McCarthy's paper. This is from a paper that Marty Banks did. Some of you may be familiar with him from Banks' lab at University of California, Berkeley. But what's in this circle is what we can see, and this line in the center is what we want to see, and then all of this other stuff is aliases. And notice that some of the aliases are nice and dark, and some of them are pretty light gray. Well, if we increase the contrast, we make the aliases more visible. So this is the version that's in Sean McCarthy's paper. This is showing that as we increase the luminance, the flicker becomes more visible, and this is showing that as we increase the field of view, the flicker becomes more visible because peripheral vision is more sensitive to flicker. Now I've added just two little things over here. So this is a typical low-end TV at the moment, and that's 24 frames per second. So using a low-end TV, we're right on the borderline of whether the flicker of 20 or the fusion of 24 frame per second motion is going to be okay. But this is 60 frames per second, and it's fine, you know, even out to the 60-degree field of view. So that stuff is fine. But if you look at the Dolby demos of Dolby Vision, you might notice that the motion looks terrible because they've shot it at 24 frames per second. And 24 frames per second with higher dynamic range is more noticeably not great. Here's some more stuff from McCarthy's paper. The brighter you make the picture, the harder it is to make something bright in the picture look bright. It's kind of counterintuitive, but the brighter things are, the less things look bright. And then this is truly bizarre, this hue expansion. As the picture gets brighter, notice that the yellow has gotten more range over here, so there's been expansion in that area. And then down in the blues, there's a different expansion, so you can see more of the sort of cyan over here and less of the cyan up there. Absolutely bizarre, not an effect that I had been familiar with before his paper. Here's another counterintuitive thing. I mentioned there was this BBC paper about interconversion of dynamic range formats at NAB. Well, HDR can mean less dynamic range. Well, what do I mean by that? If you have a 10-bit system or something and you're currently using 0 to 100 IRE, well, in the HDR system, that's standard definition, that's HDR. And so now you have less dynamic range for what you had previously been shading for. Okay, number 7, do we need a COM act for HDR? Now, everybody who talks about HDR says the purpose of HDR is for things like specular reflections. So this is a gorgeous computer graphics image that was made. It's public domain, but it's absolutely fantastic, so I'm giving credit. You can see all the various reflections, looks totally wonderful, and that's all specular reproduction. And if you do that, everything is great. But here is an ad from Samsung for their HDR TV, and that's what they're showing that you're going to be watching. So the picture is white. So that's okay if we can have some kind of a COM act for HDR. What if there's no COM act for HDR? That's yikes number 1. And why is it a yikes? Well, 1,000 nits now, coming maybe 2,000 nits, 4,000 nits. Dolby's already been showing stuff on the Pulsar monitor. That's a 4,000 nit monitor. SMPTE ST2084, as you saw before, goes out to 10,000 nits. So what happens if you're watching the Winter Games and it's all skiing or ice skating or something like that, and then you decide to change channels and watch a noir movie? And this adaptation stuff can take minutes. You're hearing people talking about VR before. So here's Bleaching adaptation from Sean McCarthy's paper. So maybe do not drive immediately after watching HDR. And we have yikes number 2, ambient lighting. So there's a typical home viewing condition, and there's the light that's on and the blinds are open. This movie came out recently. How many people have not seen this movie? Okay, a fair number of you, so let me give you a spoiler alert. I'm going to reveal something. It's not a big reveal. It comes out in the first minute of the movie. The movie is kind of divided into 3 acts. One act is the introduction of the Macintosh. Second act is the introduction of the next computer. Third act is the introduction of the iPhone. And in all 3 of the acts, a thing that frustrates Steve Jobs is he wants to get the exit lights in the auditorium off so he can do a blackout. And they don't let him turn off the exit lights, so he can't do a blackout. And this tremendously frustrates him. So here's the SMPTE conference this past fall, courtesy of Ken Kirschbaumer. You can sort of make out a SMPTE logo up there. The people are reasonably well exposed. Now, here are lights, and those lights are aimed up, and so sure enough, you can see the blue, but watch where the screen cuts off the blue, and wham! It blasts out those lights that are aimed right up at the ceiling. And look at the walls. Here's another one. This was a Sony demonstration of 4K done at the Westfield View Cinema in the UK. And look at how much you can see in there. Now, we actually take advantage of this at the Metropolitan Opera. This is the last 10 minutes of every one of our transmissions. We provide our own exit lighting. Because the opera ends when the opera ends, it's not to schedule, and the projectionist doesn't know when it ended, and so he can't turn the lights on, so we turn the lights on. And it seems to work very well. So let's go back to that Westfield View. Look at how bright that screen is over there on either side. Now, that's not the projector. That's the light coming off the screen, hitting the audience, and going back to the screen. So this is what's happening, whether it's a home TV or a movie screen. There's light that's coming off it, and it's hitting the ceiling and the wall, and it's hitting you, and it's hitting the floor, and it's going back to the screen. So some of you may be familiar with Pete Luday. Used to be with Sony, now he's with Real D. And he had really scientists go into a bunch of theaters and measure stuff, and what they found was that the greatest reflection in a movie theater comes from the audience. And as you can see, the seats here not particularly visible, but the people are all very visible. So he came to a conclusion on that basis: for the best HDR results, empty the auditorium. But it's really only an issue when things are very bright. So, there's a bright screen, and that's what's doing the reflection. If the screen wasn't that bright, it would be okay. So again, conclusion for best HDR results, make the screen black. Which means that if we're talking 0.005 nits, then this might be viewer attire that's required for HDR. And again, it's not just the cinemas. There's a home TV. The TV is off. Can't get any blacker than off. Here's another TV. It's off. Can't get any blacker than off. Power consumption, another interesting one. When they did the viewer tests to come up with SMPTE 2084, this is what they used: a digital cinema projector projecting into a ground glass screen. You're basically looking into a digital cinema projector. It was all covered with drapes to make it dark except for the screen that you were looking at. And here's the Dolby Pulsar. The Pulsar monitor is liquid cooled. So what about white field? What happens if you do a white field? Well, here's a Samsung TV that says it's a HDR TV, and typical power consumption, 73 watts, terrific for a 55-inch TV. Maximum power consumption, 215 watts. Now, I looked up the California regulation, and if it was for HDR, this would be violating the regulation. The regulation would say it has to be less than 178 watts. But the way that they measure is not yet designed for HDR, so that's why they can probably sell that. Now, one of the cool things is the California law only goes up to 1,400 square inches, which is a 57-inch TV. So one way of getting around the California law is make sure all of your TVs are 58 inches or larger.